I was at a dinner party recently, and I was watching these two friends debate a fairly complex social issue.
Okay.
And one of them, let's just call him the logician, he was so relentlessly focused on, data points, rigid definitions.
I'm the numbers guy.
Exactly, the numbers guy. And the other, we'll call her Sarah, she was really trying to explain why the issue mattered to her community, the human side of it.
The context.
The context, precisely. And at one point, the whole conversation just sort of naturally shifted. Sarah, she stopped citing percentages, and instead, she shared this personal story about her childhood. It was this real moment of vulnerability, It explained the emotional weight behind her whole stance, and to anyone watching, it felt like a deepening of the dialogue. The abstract suddenly became real.
Right.
But then, the logician, he pounced. He didn't nod. He didn't acknowledge her experience at all. Instead, he got this tight, victorious smile on his face and just cut her off. He just said, "That's a red herring. You're pivoting to emotion to distract from the original argument. That's a logical fallacy."
Wow.
And he sat back looking around the table like he was expecting applause for spotting the infraction. But the reaction was fascinating. The room didn't feel clearer. It just felt dead.
The air just went out of it.
Completely. By strictly enforcing the rules of logic, he hadn't won the argument. He'd completely suffocated the communication. He treated the conversation like it was a courtroom transcript where any deviation is an error.
And he failed to realize that human connection is almost never linear. It's messy.
It's so messy. And it really made me realize that our obsession with calling out red herrings might actually be the biggest barrier to understanding what people are really truly saying. And that feeling, that deep structural tension, that's exactly what we're diving into today. This deep dive is all about that fundamental disconnect between pure, rational, data-driven logic and the messy emotional reality of our political and social issues.
It's a huge disconnect.
It is. When we talk about these complex problems, systemic inequality, trade, immigration policy, why is it that any attempt to bring in context or human emotion or lived experience gets instantly shot down as some kind of irrelevant fallacy?
Right.
We need to look at the immense cost of this strict adherence to data-only thinking, especially when all the evidence shows that emotion and identity, they aren't distractions from the policy. They are the core driving mechanisms of our public discourse today.
That tension you just described, where Sarah's legitimate experience is just dismissed by the logician as some manipulative tool.
Yeah.
That's a problem that, intellectual and policy communities face constantly.
So it's not just at dinner parties.
Not at all. Maybe people who rely on that kind of data-driven structural analysis, they really struggle to acknowledge the constructive role that emotional expression and, broadening the context can play. For them, it feels like they're succumbing to irrationality or sacrificing their analytical rigor.
And our mission today is to really break down that false dichotomy.
Exactly. We'll start by looking at the hard data, the numbers that prove the dominance of emotion, and specifically anger, in our public dialogue. Then, we're going to explore the powerful structural roots of this anti-intellectual feeling that causes people to reject pure facts, often because of who is delivering those facts.
The logician himself.
The logician himself. And finally, we'll analyze how language is used very systematically, not just to discuss complex ideas, but to completely transform them into simplified, identity-based emotional conflicts that make rational debate almost impossible.
Okay, so let's start with the hard evidence.
Yeah.
We really need to establish that the dynamic you see at a dinner party where frustration just completely overrides the facts isn't anecdotal. It's the defining quantitative characteristic of political communication today.
Especially online, which is where most of this discourse is happening.
Right.
We have some really robust observational data that shows this massive, persistent, quantitative shift in how citizens engage with policy. So since 2013, if you analyze social media messages, we're talking tweets here, focus on policy issues, the proportion of those messages that express anger has gone up. And not just a little. It's strongly and relentlessly risen.
And what does that look like in terms of numbers?
It's a dramatic change.
Yeah.
It's nearly doubled across the period we're looking at, climbing from around 25% of policy tweets to approximately 50%.
Wow. Wait, so in less than a decade, half, literally half of all public policy discussion online is being filtered through the lens of anger.
That's the new baseline. And look at what's going away at the same time. Tweets without any emotional classification have declined significantly. They've dropped from about 70% down to 50%.
So it's a direct replacement.
It is.
Yeah,
A space that was once occupied by factual, neutral, or just non-emotional discussion has been, you could say, colonized by anger.
And when did this really kick into high gear? Because 2013 is the starting point, but shifts in political emotion, they usually align with major national events, right?
That's a crucial detail. The trend was already upward, but the sharpest, steepest rise in anger among citizens begins immediately after the 2016 U.S. presidential election.
I think we can all remember that feeling.
We can. And that upward momentum just continued, unabated, throughout the subsequent administration. This suggests that the environment itself became a kind of persistent trigger. It wasn't a seasonal spike or a cyclical thing. It was a fundamental structural change where anger just became the default emotional register for talking about policy.
So we have a very clear, very measurable demand side. The citizens are, for lack of a better term, screaming in anger online.
Yes.
So now let's look at the political supply side. How do elected officials, political parties, how do they respond when their constituency is communicating primarily through this negative emotion?
They align with it perfectly. It's a feedback loop. The political actors, policymakers, campaigners, official party accounts, they've mirrored this trend, which just reinforces the cycle.
So they're feeding the beast, so to speak.
They are. When you analyze policy-focused communications, everything from official party tweets, congressional tweets, even floor speeches and campaign speeches, anger is consistently the dominant emotion being conveyed.
And this isn't just for a few hot-button issues.
No, it holds across widely debated structural issues, things like abortion, state of democracy, taxation, economic inequality. It's everywhere.
But this can't be altruistic. There has to be a clear incentive for them, right? An electoral or an influence incentive for them to choose anger over, say, logic or even positive emotions like hope or excitement.
Absolutely. The incentive is transparent and it's quantifiable. It's amplification.
More eyeballs.
Way more eyeballs.
Yeah.
Congressional tweets that convey anger receive nearly 50% more retweets than tweets that don't have any emotional content. That's a massive premium on emotional intensity.
Wait, say that again? 60% more, half again.
Yes. So if a neutral, factual policy tweet gets, say, 1,000 retweets, a functionally similar tweet that's just infused with anger will get closer to 1,500.
That's staggering.
It creates this very clear, demand-driven explanation for why we see this increasing reliance on negative emotional rhetoric. The angry post generates the engagement, the visibility, the amplification you need for political survival and influence.
And when success is tied directly to that emotional intensity,
then complexity, nuance, data, all the tools of the logician, they're structurally penalized. They get pushed to the margins because they just don't perform as well.
And this is where it gets really, really interesting because emotion isn't just about amplification. The evidence suggests it fundamentally alters how people evaluate and support specific policy proposals.
Yes, we're talking about causality now.
So what did the experimental evidence show? What happens when you intentionally expose people to negative emotions?
The causal effects are profound and, frankly, sometimes counterintuitive. Researchers ran experiments where they had participants watch video treatments designed to induce negative emotions, frustration, a kind of low-grade anger, and they compared their policy views against groups who watched neutral or positive videos.
And the result?
The results show that negative emotions actively and dramatically shape policy preferences right across the board. They move people away from what you might call rational long-term thinking and toward immediate protective action.
Okay, give me an example. What about something like trade?
Take trade. The negative emotions cause individuals to develop significantly more pessimistic views on international trade. They become much more likely to support protectionist policies, moving away from free trade arguments.
And what's the logic there? Or the emotional logic, I guess?
The logic they adopt is rooted in fear. It's concern about being unfairly reliant on foreign goods, fear of economic exploitation by other countries, and increased focus on the perceived lower quality or safety of imported products. It essentially triggers a psychological defense mechanism against the outside world.
That pattern tracks. It feels logical. Negative emotion equals fear. Fear equals protective walls, whether they're tariffs or, actual border walls. What about immigration policy?
The same self-protective instinct takes over. Exposure to negative emotions generates greater support for restrictive immigration measures.
More than just, say, wanting more border security.
Much more. In one really crucial finding, the negative emotion treatment influenced immigration policy preferences by increasing support for aggressive large-scale measures. We're talking about large-scale deportation operations.
Wow.
In one analysis, that emotional intervention alone accounted for an effect size that was about 14% of the voter gap between two candidates on that very issue.
That's not a small number. That's not negligible.
Not at all. It shows that a pervasive emotional atmosphere can genuinely shift the needle in an election or on a key legislative vote.
So negative emotions seem to drive these traditionally protective, often right-wing policies. But we also have evidence that anger can push people toward policies we typically associate with the political left. How does that contradiction work itself out?
And this is the critical finding that really complicates the logician's worldview. It shows why emotion isn't just some simplistic political tool. Negative emotions also foster more favorable attitudes toward redistribution.
So more support for social programs.
Exactly. They bolster support for traditionally left-wing redistributive policies, things like significantly increasing income tax rates for high earners to finance cash transfers or social programs for the poor.
Okay, hold on. If anger makes me want protectionist trade policies and stricter borders, why is that same anger suddenly making me support greater wealth redistribution? That sounds like a major internal conflict.
The key is where you attribute responsibility. The researchers found that the positive effect on redistribution is primarily driven by one thing. Negatively treated respondents are significantly more likely to attribute poverty and inequality to external circumstances.
Ah, so it's about blame.
It's all about blame. When people are in a neutral or positive emotional state, they're more likely to subscribe to the traditional American ethos, right? The idea that success or failure is mostly due to individual effort, motivation, or just poor personal choices.
So they blame the individual for their poverty.
And therefore, they reject redistribution. But when people are angry or frustrated or pessimistic, they stop blaming the poor for a lack of effort. Their own heightened negative emotional state makes them much more receptive to the idea that systemic failure or structural barriers or external economic factors are what's limiting upward mobility.
The blame shifts from the individual to the system.
Precisely. And if the system is broken, well, then the government has to intervene to correct that inequality.
That is a fundamental psychological mechanism we have to understand. The anger isn't partisan in its origin, it's an engine. It just increases the desire for strong, protective, and corrective action, whether that action is building a wall to protect trade or tearing down a wealth disparity to correct an economic injustice.
It all flows from a core demand for justice and security, and it's all driven by frustration.
And if we bring this all the way back to the dinner table, Sarah's frustration, her personal story that the logician dismissed as a red herring, it wasn't irrelevant at all.
Not in the slightest. It was likely a direct expression of this kind of systemic anger that, if he had followed it, could have led to a much deeper discussion about the external circumstances driving the very policy issue they were debating.
By dismissing her emotion, he cut off the psychological root of her entire policy preference. He missed the why.
He missed everything. And it seems like this is where classical liberal and, moderate conservative thinkers who really prize that structural analysis, this is where they struggle. They want to rely purely on data, but if they want to apply their knowledge effectively, they have to understand that this human drive for recognition and security, fueled by negative emotion, is what determines whether those data points are even accepted in the first place.
So the emotional expression isn't noise, it's a data point in itself.
It's a vital indicator. It tells you where the speaker is attributing blame and what kind of security they're looking for. To ignore it is to completely ignore the political landscape.
So if emotion is this powerful, if it can actually shift policy preferences, it's really no wonder that these strict, rational arguments often feel like they're just hitting a brick wall.
Right.
And this brings us back to my friend, the logician, and the structural reasons why his data-focused arguments, which are so often delivered by educated elites, are so profoundly and, frankly, often contemptuously rejected by huge segments of the population.
This takes us right into the very complex intersection of anti-elitism and anti-intellectualism. And we really need to define the difference first.
Okay.
So anti-elitism is the rejection of the entitlement, the superior social position, and the power of a privileged class. It's a critique of power and arrogance.
And anti-intellectualism.
That's different. Anti-intellectualism is the rejection of knowledge or specialized expertise or the very process of intellectual inquiry itself.
And what we see in the current climate is that those two concepts are just completely blurred. They almost operate as synonyms for each other. Why does that happen, especially in Western democracies?
It's because the institutions that manage knowledge, our schools, our universities, our policy centers, they simultaneously serve two functions: and those functions are sometimes contradictory.
How so?
On the one hand, they are, of course, essential spaces for intellectual inquiry. It's where people learn critical thinking, they engage in sustained research, they try to address unanswered questions. But, and this is crucial, they're also enormous engines for conferring social status and class advantage.
A college degree is the ticket to the upper middle class, basically.
It's often a non-negotiable prerequisite for almost all of the most advantaged, high-status positions in our social order. And beyond that, these educational institutions, they don't just train students in technical skills, they train them in specific cultural capital.
You mean manners, modes of social interaction?
And particular ways of speaking. I think of what the historian Richard Hofstadter called the Groton vocabulary. It's not just about using big words, it's a particular rhythm, a certain set of shared cultural assumptions, and way of framing problems that immediately signals, I am an insider.
Exactly. The Groton vocabulary refers to those subtle, often unconscious markers of the advantaged class. When the logician spoke to Sarah, his dismissal of her lived experience in favor of this abstract logical rule, a red herring, that was an act of cultural performance.
It was. It said, my rules of engagement are superior to your reality.
And so, when ordinary people reject the elite, they are often rejecting the institutions and the social performance that confers that status, which means rejecting intellectual expertise. Anti-intellectualism feels like a righteous, necessary step in rejecting the arrogance and privilege. Anti-elitism.
The two become one. Hofstadter noted that the historical far-right wing critique wasn't just targeted at, say, Wall Street money. It was often a categorical, folkish dislike aimed at all educated classes. It rejected anything that was perceived as respectable, established, pedigreed, or cultivated.
So they were against both Wall Street and Harvard.
Yes, because to them, both represented the same disconnected, advantaged class, just operating in different spheres.
And this deep skepticism, it's got to be reinforced by the perceived incompetence of the ruling class itself.
This is where the critique offered by Christopher Lasch decades ago becomes, frankly, frighteningly relevant today. Lasch argued in The Culture of Narcissism that the therapeutic state, managed by professional elites, has systematically reduced the general population to a state of incompetence.
The idea being that experts are constantly stepping in as therapists, managers, regulators, to manage every little aspect of life, which ironically fosters this pervasive sense of dependency and helplessness among average citizens.
That's the structural consequence. And Lasch went even further. He defined the modern narcissistic personality. This type, he argued, is dependent on external reflection for validation, possesses a deep sense of inner emptiness, and harbors this boundless, often repressed rage.
And he thought this personality type was suited for power.
Ideally suited for modern positions of power. Why? Because they are callous climbers who are intensely focused on projecting a winning image rather than demonstrating actual competence or integrity. Their core skill is just self-promotion.
So you have a population that's been trained into dependence, and it's being managed by elites whose primary skill is just projecting a competent image while maybe lacking true substance. What on earth does that do to our belief in the political process?
It creates what Lasch called a crippling cynicism in the whole political process. People reach a point where they genuinely believe that no change is possible at all and all politicians are corrupt.
And when the logician presents his data,
the data itself is dismissed because the speaker is automatically seen as a representative of this self-serving, incompetent elite.
Lasch also pointed a finger at the media, didn't he?
He did. He noted the destructive role of mass media, which helps foster this chronic tension and cynical detachment. By treating everything, political events, tragedies, social issues, as a kind of parody or a put-on, the media creates an endless hall of mirrors effect.
An endless hall of mirrors where we can no longer distinguish reality from the fabricated image.
Exactly. And when reality and image just collapse into each other, a sober, rational appeal to facts, the logos, it loses its anchoring power. If everything is mediated and potentially manipulative, why should I trust your data over my gut feeling? Especially when my gut feeling is validated by my community and amplified by my social media feed.
Okay, so let's use this whole structural context to reframe the logician's failure at the dinner party. This is the populist hypothesis. The logician, in his arrogance and his insistence on abstract rules, is actually part of the problem that generates the rejection in the first place. He is. Think about it. If the workforce is divided, you have those working with their hands, often holding a lower social status, versus those working with symbols, data, and abstract ideas, The elites, the manual workers, are naturally going to question the value proposition.
Right. Why should my taxes pay for the salaries of these abstract symbol manipulators?
Exactly. We see this all the time. Citizens in small towns complain that big decisions are decreed from major metro areas like Madison or Washington without any authentic listening.
And their resentment focuses acutely on the desk job white professionals who embody this detached power structure. For people who feel like they're repeatedly penalized or exploited by the intellectual class by rules, regulations, jargon, and dismissiveness,
Avoiding smart people becomes a strategy.
it transforms into a necessary and rational defense mechanism. It's a valid trouble avoidance strategy. When a degree or a citation is presented arrogantly, it is not received as expertise. It's seen as a red flag used by the people who exploit them.
So the emotional rejection of data, like what happened with Sarah, it's rooted in this really valid structural sense of betrayal.
It is. The logician might see himself as an institutional watchman protecting reason. But to Sarah, he's just enforcing the cultural supremacy of the very class that has overseen societal decline and treated her community's concerns as a mere distraction.
And this structural rejection it's key for thinkers in those classical liberal and moderate conservative traditions to understand. If they want their data-driven structural analyses to be heard, they can't just rely on the rigor of the data.
They can't. They first have to overcome the deep-seated skepticism that views them, just by virtue of their status, as inherently suspicious or incompetent representatives of the status quo. The logician has to address the pathos of his audience before his logos can ever be accepted. So now we can pivot. We move from the reasons people reject pure logic to examine how discourse itself is actively used to strip complex ideas of their context. It's about weaponizing emotion for political gain.
And as we've established, language is not a neutral vessel, it's productive.
It is inherently productive. Discourse shapes our realities, our values, our understanding of what's even possible. It forms these systems of words that convey and reinforce ideologies and structures of power and knowledge.
And this is often an invisible process.
Highly effective because it's invisible. Ideology creates and acts in a social world while it masquerades as a description of that world. The real power is in creating the shared narrative, not just describing reality.
This is where the logician's strict adherence to context-free data is at its most dangerous. Because if you don't control the discourse, a complex academic idea can be very rapidly simplified and transformed into an emotional weapon.
That's right. And the most potent, most well-documented example of this kind of structural manipulation in recent memory is the rapid transformation and political commodification of critical race theory, or CRT.
Okay, let's just lay out what CRT was originally, because I think the original definition is often completely lost in the noise.
It really is. CRT, which originated among legal scholars back in the 1980s, was strictly a scholarly framework. It was a rigorous tool designed for studying and transforming systemic relations between race, racism, domination, and power structures, specifically within the legal and social system.
Its purpose was to amplify marginalized voices, address deep structural issues.
Right, not to serve as an elementary school curriculum.
Right.
But if we look at national news media coverage between September 2020 and July 2021, CRT was subjected to this rapid four-stage process of degradation: colonization, co-optation, inflation, and commodification.
And that transformation completely eviscerated the theory of its scholarly context.
And replaced it with a simplified, weaponized, identity-based concept.
Okay, let's break those down, starting with colonization and co-optation. It sounds like the conversation about CRT was just taken over.
That's exactly it. Colonization happens when the debate around the original theory gets dominated by external, often hostile voices who get to define the terms. Co-optation is when the original complex goals of the theory are stripped away and replaced with a single, simplified, politically useful narrative.
And in this case?
In this case, conservative news media outlets promulgated a dominant yet baseless narrative. They packaged CRT neatly as a liberal plot to destroy America and indoctrinate children.
And that packaging, that's the commodification. You make it marketable as a kind of moral panic.
Of course. If you can define it as an existential threat to your children, the emotional intensity will override any logical critique you can offer. The original theory, which was dense and abstract, was made emotionally accessible and easily transmissible.
And the language they used to mischaracterize it became incredibly consistent.
Extremely consistent across political media. CRT was repeatedly, systematically labeled as racist, rewriting history, divisive, destructive, and anti-American. This constant repetition, completely divorced from his actual academic meaning, made the concept appear vast, monstrous, and inherently threatening to established cultural norms.
This brings us to the mechanism of utterance, reproduction. Can you explain how this repeated mischaracterization doesn't just describe a threat, but actively creates it in the public mind?
Utterance reproduction is one of the most powerful concepts in modern discourse analysis. It argues that the very utterance of a harmful ideology or mischaracterization works to create, to reify, and to disseminate that ideology.
Even if the speaker's intent is to argue against it.
Even then, we've talked about the teabag analogy before. You dip the ideology into the public consciousness and it just steeps and spreads, polluting the water whether you claim you like the tea or not. And the key is what happened with moderate and liberal media sources. They would often report on the arguments being made by the conservative sources. So for instance, they'd run a story reporting on a political figure's claim that CRT is divisive or racist.
But they wouldn't correct the misdefinition.
They would frequently forego correcting the misdefinitions or providing adequate, detailed scholarly context for what CRT actually is. So by reproducing the harmful utterance without that contextual correction, they inadvertently contributed to the conceptual inflation.
So the monster just got bigger.
The monstrous conception of CRT grew larger, more menacing, inflated, because even those trying to talk about it were forced to repeat the simplified, weaponized labels. They repeated the terms, giving them broader cultural currency, and structurally reinforced the very mischaracterization they might have intended to refute.
So the result is that this complex scholarly framework was simplified, stripped of its original context, which is ironically the logician's worst nightmare, and then amplified into an emotional identity flashpoint. What was the ultimate political goal here beyond just winning an argument?
The goal was clear: defense and protection. The purposive obfuscation and commodification of CRT functioned as a powerful defense of whiteness and white supremacist culture. CRT's original aim was to expose systemic relations of power, but it was co-opted and framed as an immediate personal threat of replacement or condemnation.
And once that mischaracterized concept was commodified and successfully sold to the audience,
it led to its bodification. That's where individuals internalize the idea that CRT is a direct attack on them, on their children, on their values. And at that point, it becomes an unassailable belief. It linked easily to existing rhetoric of cultural replacement and perceived threat that was already circulating.
So in effect, the meaning of CRT was fundamentally changed through language and discourse. It moved from a scholarly tool into this divisive, destructive monster that was used to reinforce hegemonic values.
Absolutely. So the logician, insisting on a rational definition of CRT, wouldn't even be arguing the same subject as the person who has internalized the monster myth.
It's two different realities.
It is. And the intellectual who argues that the logician must be an institutional watchman protecting reason against the emotional appeal of woke culture is overlooking the fact that the emotional appeal itself is the result of a very sophisticated, targeted discourse strategy. They dismiss Sarah's emotion as a red herring, when that emotion is the predictable and intended result of a political machine designed to generate fear and protect identity.
And this brings us right to the core tension of it all. What the logician and the data-driven rationalist continually miss is that emotion and identity are not distractions from policy. They're fundamental human characteristics, entirely distinct from purely material or economic interests.
And this is the profound truth that populist movements inherently understand and, frankly, leverage much better than traditional liberal structures.
Identity isn't just about what group you belong to. It's a structural necessity for human flourishing, right?
It is. It's a function of three core human needs: meaning, community, and virtue. And populism is powerful because it offers compelling, non-rational responses to all three of these needs.
Okay, let's start with meaning. In an age of increasing secularization, institutional decay, where do people find a purpose that's larger than themselves?
Populism provides a readily accessible, collectivistic meaning. It offers a valuable purpose, which is to fight against dangerous, constructed enemies.
And these enemies are?
They're highly variable. They can be elites, the logician's class, or they can be external others, immigrants, cultural threats, who are perceived to threaten the established social order. This fight provides a sense of heroic purpose that is larger than yourself.
And that collective identity can become so salient that it dominates a person's individual identity.
To the point where any attack on the collective identity feels like an attack on their very being.
Okay, so that's meaning. What about community?
Populism is supremely effective at unifying large, often disparate groups of people into a collective. It offers a powerful sense of belonging. And this is acutely crucial in modern societies, where our traditional communal anchors, stable family units, strong local churches, lifelong neighborhoods are facing substantial decline.
Due to globalization, urbanization.
All of it. Populist movements fill that vacuum of belonging with shared resentment and shared defense.
And finally, recognition, which is precisely what Sarah was looking for at that dinner table. It's the human need to be acknowledged as a valid participant in the conversation.
Recognition is the essential psychological anchor. People feel seen, and this is vital, when they rally at mass meetings or when their leader bypasses the traditional media to talk directly to them, explicitly validating their resentment over feeling marginalized, unrecognized, or disrespected by elites.
Failures of recognition are not minor slights.
They can cause real psychological and social harm. Populism harnesses this politics of resentment and recognition, and it confirms that your gut feeling is valid and the elites are the ones lying to you.
And this clash over the importance of identity politics becomes a flashpoint that divides even those who are trying to fight back against populism.
It does. On one side, you have the view, often taken by those focused on social justice, that identity politics is absolutely essential for achieving justice and supporting the unpopular and downtrodden.
And from this perspective, attacks on identity politics are just,
Another red herring, used by the right wing and economic elites to distract from the real issues of exploitation and systemic inequality. They argue you have to focus on identity to correct historic wrongs.
But then there's the other side.
And this is where the logician's critique, or the critique often espoused by certain institutional watchmen against woke culture, comes in. They worry that focusing too heavily on social and cultural issues, often associated with what they see as an obnoxious aesthetics, a focus on jargon and sensitivity risks, alienating and losing wider support among the majority of the working class.
The view that most people prioritize material well-being over the culture wars.
Oh, that's the argument. That the majority prioritizes being able to afford housing, having a well-paying job, economic stability. And they would suggest that the logician's dismissal of emotion, while personally suffocating to Sarah, might be viewed by some political strategists as a calculated attempt to redirect the political focus back onto material economics.
So you've got the structural intellectual class, the logician, who believes his role is to fight irrationality with data. But he's standing in front of a populist movement that is winning because it provides meaning and community, not charts and graphs.
That is the liberal predicament. Classical liberalism, which is based on reason, rights, and constitutionalism, struggles mightily against populist movements that skillfully deploy these powerful emotional appeals.
Liberalism relies almost exclusively on logos, logic, and facts.
But, as Aristotle knew, in the realm of human persuasion, you need more than just logic. You absolutely need pathos, emotion, and ethos, character and credibility. And when liberalism struggles, it's because it often appears temperamentally detached, even ruthless, in its pursuit of abstract institutional efficiency.
It talks about systems and data, but fails to connect on a human level. It looks cold and uncaring compared to the warm, if resentful, embrace of populism.
The core challenge for these classical liberal and moderate intellectual traditions is that they must develop a robust liberal politics of recognition and respect. They have to apply their nuanced understanding of communication, acknowledging Sarah's emotional expression and context to their structural analysis without feeling like they're giving in to irrationality.
So what does that look like?
It means cultivating and communicating the liberal spirit, a temperament marked by a genuine openness to complexity, a willingness to acknowledge uncertainty, a deep tolerance for difference, and a critical resistance to political ruthlessness. Liberals need compelling ethical narratives.
Not just better data visualization.
Exactly. They need to show that a pluralistic, tolerant, liberal society provides better opportunities for human flourishing, for meaning, community, and virtue than any collectivist, populist alternative. It's not enough to defend liberal institutions rationally. You have to communicate their inherent moral and emotional superiority.
Which means overcoming the very critique made by those institutional watchmen who worry about the corrosiveness of identity politics. The solution isn't to dismiss identity and emotion as red herrings, but to offer a competing, positive, and inclusive identity that can stand up against the resentment-fueled negative identity offered by populism. So, our journey today began with the logician who shut down a conversation by strictly enforcing the red herring fallacy. And what we've seen is that this single failure reflects a massive structural shift in how we communicate and organize our politics. The sharp, persistent rise in public anger isn't just a distraction. It is a powerful force that drives policy support right across the political spectrum. And it's rooted in valid feelings of anti-elitism and helplessness, stemming from a ruling class that's perceived as incompetent.
And we learned that these complex anxieties are systematically weaponized through very specific communication strategies, the commodification and inflation of terms like CRT transforming nuanced scholarly ideas into emotional, identity-based monsters.
So dismissing context and emotion as merely a red herring ignores these core drivers of contemporary political engagement: the deep human needs for meaning, for community, and for recognition.
When the logician cut off Sarah's story, he was trying to force a rigid courtroom linearity onto a deeply complex, nonlinear human and structural problem.
And the challenge for anyone engaged in structural analysis, for those of us who truly wish to achieve genuine, thorough communication, is to embrace that complex emotional reality. True understanding isn't just about correcting a logical error or supplying a missing data point.
It's about recognizing the underlying emotional and identity-based logic of the attacker. The resentment, the lack of recognition, the yearning for community, and integrating that human context into the structural discussion. The logician failed entirely to do that. In doing so, he failed to persuade, he failed to connect, and ultimately he failed to communicate the very data he held so dear.